Welcome to Peculiar Tales, the show where we dive into the stranger things in history, urban legends, ghost stories, and anything else we find, well, peculiar. I'm Christy.
And I'm Dawn. So, Christy, how do you feel about fame? Some people say they would like to be rich over famous.
I can agree with that statement because I think being famous really it puts you in the limelight, right? Everybody's looking at everything. So I could understand how people are saying like I'd like to be rich like famous people are, but I don't necessarily want to be famous like famous people are. I get that. I kind of agree with that statement.
Because although maybe it would be nice to be recognized for what you do and
For sure.
liked for what you do, maybe could get overwhelming.
Oh, I feel like it probably does get overwhelming really easily for people. I mean, it's a lot, right? It's basically in your face all the time, so I
I
can
agree with
understand
you.
that.
And today's story, well, it includes somebody who actually wanted the fame. So today's tale is one that includes influence, mental illness, illusions, and tragedy. The troubled life of Zelda Fitzgerald started on July 24th, 1900, and eventually ended on March 10th, 1948. Zelda was the daughter of a judge who some say was sexually assaulted when she was 15 years old by two members from Alabama's high society. When Zelda was 18, she met F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was 20 years old and in the Army at the time. His position was a second lieutenant. He was never shipped out, and it's said later in life that this would bother him. The two fell in love at first sight. They wrote back and forth while Scott was in the Army. Scott was discharged and hoped to marry Zelda. So, after the very romantic gesture of sending his mother's engagement ring to Zelda through the mail, she turned down the proposal due to his advertising job not being impressive enough. So, naturally, Scott quit his job and he moved to St. Paul to finish writing the book he started in Princeton before he dropped out and went to the Army. The book was called This Side of Paradise. The book was published and was a bestseller. This did, in fact, impress Zelda, the two got married on April 3rd, 1920.
The couple were in the public's eyes and were very happy and in love and very famous now. Zelda was from a wealthy family, and Scott, he came from a middle-class Catholic family. The success that came with the book was all theirs. They were, by all accounts, living their best life. Things were about to change for the Fitzgeralds when Francis Scott Scotty Fitzgerald was born on October 26, 1921, in St. Paul, Minnesota. By most accounts, the couple still lived a partying lifestyle and kept up appearances as well. In 1922, Scott wrote another book called The Beautiful and the Damned. Zelda loved her clothes and would use her socialite status to give interviews to help promote her husband's books. She was said to be a bit cheeky in these interviews, but she felt she was helping.
The couple were living beyond what they could afford. There were parties, jazz music, fashion, and high expenses of being socialites. It is said that Zelda was the first flapper girl of the 20s. The two were living it up, the best of things and people. And because of this, they spent the money quicker than it was coming in. There were many loans to cover the costs, and Scott would then need to write something again, and so the hamster wheel went. But before long, though, the illusion of a perfect life would get hard to keep up with. Zelda and Scott thought that since Frances was being breastfed, that Zelda could not get pregnant, and they found out just how wrong they were. By this time, the two were heavy drinkers and enjoyed their social life. Zelda went to New York and had an abortion. At the time, Scott agreed it was for the best. However, some say that this is something he did hold against her. Scott wrote only this in his ledger for March of 1922. Quote unquote, Zelda and her abortionist.
By the early 20s, Scott wrote short stories that were basically the work of Zelda, but because at the time the publishers thought the stories would sell better with his name on them, they only put her name as a byline. Zelda was also the inspiration for the novels he wrote. In his books, he used parts of her diary in his storyline. Zelda gave an interview once and said this: "In fact, Mr. Fitzgerald, I believe that's how you spell his name, seems to believe that plagiarism starts at home."
In 1924, the family, with an English nanny in tow, moved to the Riviera. This was so that Scott could have a quiet place to write his next novel, away from the chaos at home. This was the start of 7 years in Europe for the family. It was in the spring of 1924 when Zelda became bored. She seemed to have enough of being in the shadows. Zelda knew the secrets the world didn't. So Zelda knew that she was a big part of his success. So she set out to try to make a name for herself. Unfortunately, it was a time when women were not encouraged to do their own things, but rather be the trophy wives of their husbands.
The day came when Zelda went to the beach and made friends with 3 French naval aviators. Zelda started an affair with one of them. The aviator's name was Edward Josiane. At first, Scott viewed the two of them as nothing more than friends, a little relieved someone was there to keep Zelda happy. Sometime into this friendship, though, as Scott seen it, he noticed that Zelda was spending all of her time with Edward, and this did not sit well with Scott. It is said by some that Zelda wanted a divorce and that she loved the French aviator. Scott declined the offer of a divorce, and the aviator, it is said, was now out of the picture. In 1925, Scott published The Great Gatsby, and as it turns out, it was a failure of its time. No one quite liked it. Scott was still very much a heavy drinker, and the two together were still toxic for each other.
At 25 years old, a mother and a wife, she fell in love with ballet. She trained with a Russian ballerina in Paris, and it is said that ballet quickly consumed her. It was an outlet for her and just for her, not the socialites at home or her husband. This was all hers. Finally, she was making a name for herself and not under the shadows of another person. Scott, on the other hand, was becoming an alcoholic and getting pretty jealous. Zelda had another abortion, and it is said to have happened in Paris in June of 1926. In Scott's ledger, he wrote that there was an operation, but in a letter in June, he wrote that Zelda had an appendectomy. 7 months later, in his ledger, he wrote again that Zelda had an appendectomy. I mean, how many appendixes did Zelda have?
There is documentation that shows May of 1926, Zelda changed doctors for a short while, and after that June never went back to the new doctor, leaving room for speculation that is when she decided to not be pregnant. After the June operation, Zelda healed physically, but mentally she took a hit. There was a time that Zelda, after a night of heavy drinking, in the early hours of the next morning, laid in front of a car and dared Scott to run her over. And as time marched on, their friends noticed that the couple seemed to be searching for happiness at the bottom of a bottle. As it was, they would never find happiness again.
Zelda wrote some quote unquote girls' stories and hoped to pay for her ballet school. Ballet was not easy, it was hard, and she needed much discipline. It was taxing on her body, and after a while, it took a toll on her mental health because the lines are now being blurred between her reality at home and life as a ballerina. She was all consumed with attaining perfection. Life at home was not good due to her fragile mental health, and in 1928 and 29, Zelda's body was changing, becoming thinner. Her ankles were delicate, and she had high arches in her feet. Now, Zelda was offered to join the ballet in 1929 in a production of Ada. This offer also came with a monthly salary. This production would offer her solos that would highlight her talents. Zelda turned the opportunity down, and some think this was because she wasn't thinking clearly due to her mental health issues. Zelda's mental health started to show. She became unpredictable. She would be having a great time partying, and then the next, she was hysterical.
And by 1930, Zelda had her first mental breakdown. Zelda stayed in Switzerland for 15 months, from June 1930 to September of 1931. During this time, it was one of isolation and reflection. At first, Zelda was not allowed visitors. This was a huge change from being in the social eye for so long as an it girl, you could say, and stopping her ballet as well. Scott would be nice and send her short notes and flowers, but this did nothing as not actually being there took its toll. Zelda was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but today she would have been more than likely diagnosed with bipolar. And because the Institute's approach was more home like and not hospital like, it was hoped to be more of a support for her. It was at this institute that started a lifelong issue with her relationship with Scott and her self image that would never end.
In 1932, she spent time at Baltimore at the Phipps Clinic, and while there, she wrote a book titled Save Me the Waltz. This book has been referred to as the Asylum Autobiography. The book is about a Southern girl who falls in love with an artist. They become celebrities, and the Southern girl takes to dancing. And after that, everything just falls apart. Everything is just ruined. So, as you could imagine, Scott was less than happy about the world reading this book, which basically outlines the entire marriage in what some say was Zelda's fantasy life. So, naturally, he told her not to publish it. Well, she went around him and she gave it to a publisher anyway. This infuriated Scott, so he insisted that she make many revisions. No one really knows what those were or how many because the original copy has been lost. The reviews were bad, which is surprising because she was such a big part of his short stories and his books. Makes you wonder if those revisions made it a bad book or due to her mental health not being what it used to be. Whatever the reason, people did not like the book.
The New York Times wrote this harsh review. It is not only that her publisher had not seen fit to curb an almost lusciousness of writing, but they have not given the book the elementary services of a literary proofreader. So it's not far-fetched that this too must have felt like a kick while she was down. In 1934, Zelda, it was said, helped Scott put on an art gallery show in New York. There are 13 paintings and 15 drawings. The exhibition came with mixed reviews. In 1934, she stayed at the Craig's House Institution for 9 weeks. The institution was on 60 acres of land that bordered forestry and overlooked the Hudson River. It is there that she played some golf. She wrote her last article for Esquire and started a second novel called Caesar's Things. This second novel would never be published.
Zelda also continued to paint at the Institute. However, there was a shift in her style of painting. Before her stay at the Craig House, her style was light and whimsy, you could say, and in watercolor and colorful, reminiscent of her younger days in jazz. She had talent. Although she had her painting talent, her paintings were now geometrical shapes and had precision. Some believe this could be from her treatments at the Craig House. It's worth saying that in the 1930s and 40s, treatments in various institutes that Zelda stayed at included insulin shock therapy. Now, this is where the doctors would induce a coma that at times the coma came with a seizure. These comas are said to have lasted an hour each time. There was also electroshock therapy and a multitude of medicines thought to treat schizophrenia. That's what she was diagnosed with. Some of the medicines were potassium bromide, belladonna, horse serum, and morphine. And then there was the forced inactivity, the quote unquote rest cure. Zelda found the rest cure to be distressing. Some of these treatments were controversial at the time, but still, this is what was given to Zelda.
We're not sure which treatments she endured at what institutions she stayed at, but it's fair to say none of them sound pleasant, and some sound painful. With this being said, it makes you wonder what she had to go through that would completely change her painting style so drastically. Zelda left the Craig's house in May of 34. However, her mental health continued to worsen. It is said she became suicidal, and the debt was mounting. And let's not forget, Scott is now an alcoholic. By 1936, Zelda was now in Highland Hospital, undergoing treatment for schizophrenia. Scott moved to Hollywood and started a love affair with a gossip columnist. It is said that during this time in Hollywood, Scott still wrote to Zelda, telling her of his affections and love. He tried to support her to the very end of his life.
Scott died of a heart attack in 1940. Some say due to drinking. Either way, he was now gone. It is unclear what his net worth was, but through documentation of life insurance policy, it is estimated at about $35,000. In today's money, that would be somewhere around $800,000 to $900,000. Zelda was unable to attend the funeral, which was not to be at the Fitzgerald's family plot in a Catholic cemetery, because Scott was not an acting Catholic at the time of his death. This is what Zelda had to say about Scott. In retrospect, it seems he was always planning happiness, books to read, places to go. Life seemed so promissory always when he was around. And I always believed that he could take care of everything. Although we were not close anymore, Scott was the best friend a person could have been to me.
Zelda's treatment continued, and Zelda herself in 1948 was far from the woman she once was. She was described by a hotel staff member saying, "She is anything but pretty," as well as it was commented that her hair was straggly and uncared for. Makes sense, since with all these treatments, one would think it would start to take its toll on the physical body. In the beginning of March of 1948, the hospital said she was good to go. Her current treatment was finished. Zelda wanted to stay a few more weeks just to make sure she was okay.
On March 9th, 1948, Zelda wrote a letter to her daughter that spoke of beautiful scenery and her optimistic outlook on her future that spring. The letter was positive. It was also the last thing she would ever write in her life.
Willie Mae Hall, the supervisor of all the buildings at Highland Hospital, had just finished giving Doris Anderson her orientation. Doris Anderson was a new hire post-grad registered nurse, 9 days into her job at the hospital. Both nurses started their shifts at 10 p.m. that night. During the orientation, Willie explained what Doris's responsibilities would be and what the fire rules were. This was to be Doris's first night in charge of the central building. There were 29 female patients that Doris had to do rounds for, as well as to heavily sedate them during the first round of her shift. And as expected, Doris did in fact sedate the patients during her first round.
So here's a breakdown. At 11 p.m., Ruth Dunn, Doris's coworker, does her rounds on the third floor, including the diet kitchen, and everything was fine. At 11:20, Willie left Doris to go back to Oak Lodge to check the charts where the male patients were. At 11:30, Doris was the first to smell smoke, and then she started to look where the smoke was coming from. Doris's coworker Ruth was sent by Doris to the 5th floor. Doris looked at the 4th floor for the flames but couldn't find any, and then went to the 3rd floor. Now it's 11:35, and Doris made it to the 3rd floor diet kitchen. And Doris seen the fire. Close to the dumbwaiter was a table that was on fire. The flames were nearly a foot in height, and according to Doris, the table resembled one of those fiery hoops that animals jump through in the circus. There was another table that had a hot plate and an electric kettle on it, and all of that was untouched by the fire.
Doris was now undecided as to what to do. At first, she left the kitchen quick, but then the door shut and she went back and glanced at the fire. However, at no point did Doris try to put out the fire. What Doris did decide to do was to get back to her station as fast as possible and call Willie May, because that's what Willie told her to do earlier that night in the case of an emergency. Doris was able to get the central exchange operator that tried to get a hold of Willie May, but the line was busy. It was at this point that it occurred to Doris to have the operator call the fire department. Now they did answer immediately. In these next moments, Doris tried again to let the other workers at the hospital know of the fire. The operator connected Doris to the Highland Hills building. Once connected, Doris gave instructions for them to call the Oak Lodge building and tell Dr. Basil T. Bennett, who was the hospital medical director, about the fire in the central building.
Doris and Ruth were now trying to evacuate patients from the building, with help from the other employees, as well as a person who had seen the fire and come to help, and the neighbors as well. The 4th floor had a main door that was locked. Doris unlocked this door and unlocked only one of the patient's doors. The other patient's doors stayed locked up. It was explained by Nurse Betty Ubanga, who had joined in to help, that, quote-unquote, only the violent ones or the patients incapable of helping themselves were locked up. Betty went on to say that the first thing we did was to go after the helpless ones, and they were locked in, and we felt that the others were awake and they could help themselves. I can't understand why, with all the shouting and clamor and general rattle around the place, all the others were not wakened. As soon as we got the helpless ones out and safely put away elsewhere, we rushed back in to help the others. By then we knew that some had been trapped. The smoke must have rendered them to be unable to assist themselves. They must have become unconscious and then becoming fully awakened. It is the only way I can explain it.
Doris was able to get 4 patients to a safe spot. Doris then went to the 5th floor. This is where Zelda and 10 other women were living. The smoke was so bad that Doris was unable to stay on the 5th floor long enough to wake anyone. Doris escaped the 5th floor smoke. The time is now midnight, and the fire department has arrived to the mental hospital. The flames were coming out of the central building roof. The firefighters tried to rescue the women on the 5th floor, but the screened porches and chained-up windows stopped the firefighters. The chains were meant to keep the patients in and jumping from their deaths. Ironically, the chained windows did nothing to save the lives that fateful night.
The flames were eventually put out. However, 7 patients from the 5th floor were missing, including Zelda. They were presumed dead. 2 patients that were saved from the flames died soon after. It wasn't long before the reporters arrived on the scene. Willie May told a reporter that she had been near the diet kitchen a few minutes before the fire was discovered, and seen no sign of a fire at that time. Willie went on to say that she, quote-unquote, suspected that the electric coffee urn that had been heating on the diet kitchen was to blame. But he also said to a reporter, "I heard that the fire started because of an electric coffee urn. It must have been something electric because when we reached the building, sparks and flames were all over the diet kitchen area. The fire traveled so fast it seemed no time at all until the entire building was like a furnace."
The night of March 11th, two bodies were found in the rubble of the building's south wing. One of the bodies that were found was later identified as Zelda. It was now confirmed through dental records that Zelda had died the night before. There was a coroner's inquest, and Willie Mae testified of her movements the night of the fire. The coroner's jury absolved the hospital and attendants of culpable blame. That is until April 12th, just over a month after the death of Zelda. Willie Mae said this to the police: "There are 6 places in Oak Lodge and Highlands Hospital that I have picked out that could be set on fire. I have thought about it so much I am afraid what I might do, and I want you to lock me up."
Well, fair to say this changed a few things. The police asked Willie if she set the fire on March 10th. And this is what she said to them: "I don't know. I really don't know. I don't believe I did, but I could have." So 6 hours of questioning went on, and at the end of the questioning, the police decided it was time to reopen the case of the fire of March 10th. No surprise here, but the court ordered Willie Mae to get a psychiatric evaluation done with Dr. Wesley Taylor. Taylor then told the judge that before Willie talked with the police on April 12th, she had had a dream of the 2 patients that were saved then died. Willie said that they told her this: "Since you have burned us up, now go and burn down Oak Lodge as well." Dr. Taylor also went on to say that Willie Mae assumed some other responsibilities in which she had no hand, such as a couple of small fires in the basement or the first floor of the central building about 10 months ago. At least 3 fires were in the central building over a year's time.
Each fire was easily put out, and since no one knew how they were started, none of these fires were ever reported to the fire department. Dr. Taylor made it clear that in his opinion Willie was no criminal, but however said this: "We are dealing with a hysterical woman who has been much overworked and worried, and who puts too many emphasis on dreams." So, with this, the judge sent Willie Mae to Grayland Mental Hospital in Winston-Salem for rest and observation. In 2 weeks' time, she was discharged after getting the psychological observation, which the hospital used a truth serum. Some of these talks she would admit she was responsible, and during others she said she was not responsible, but went on to explain she had her doubts about herself.
The big outcome was she needed to leave the Asheville area, as this would do her good, and it would help her heal. So, just 2 months after the fire in March, Willie Mae was living with her brother and her sister-in-law, and they were living in Mississippi on a farm. Willie Mae wrote to the Highland Hospital's director, Dr. Bennett, and said that she was in a dispute with her family over the ownership of the house. So Willie Mae went on to admit to Dr. Bennett, quote unquote, "While I was talking to my sister-in-law, a thought flashed through my mind that if this is how much you appreciate the place, I'll burn the damn thing down." That's what Willie Mae told the doctor. "I was admitted to the hospital, and all this came back up, like you said it would." The hospital had asked Dr. Bennett about Willie Mae's history, and he told them prior to this incident she was recognized that she had some minor personality disturbances consisting of her tic and asocial tendencies. but that she was one of our most conscientious and reliable nurses. Families of the deceased patients that died in March fire brought civil suits against the hospital and the employees. Settlements were made out of court. And no one was ever charged with the crime of the fateful March night in 1948. Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this story.
Like, so circling back to Zelda.
Yeah.
What a life.
Right?
So I'm in awe of this woman because with everything she went through in her life, she just kept persevering. She just kept on.
Yeah.
She kept trying. Like, so she's going from hospital to hospital, but she's still doing things that like spark interest to her. Like, she's not giving up really.
Right. Yeah, it's their whole story is just it's kind of tragic a little bit. It's like that toxic love story, right? So you kind of feel bad for both of them. It's almost like they were addicted to each other, but it was a bad way to be together.
It's kind of like they were both so successful. Like they were so good, at their thing that they were good
Mhm.
at, you know? But yet together it was like more of a competition or more of a, like
Absolutely.
that's what the feel I got
Yeah.
from it, right? It's like almost like trying to one up. She was just trying to catch up, it seemed like I want my turn.
Yeah.
And he was like, I don't want to share the limelight.
Right.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. There's just it's so sad. I
And then this
mean,
nurse
this nurse.
that causes her death. Wow.
Right? I mean, you wonder at what point, if you're having these thoughts as somebody who's there to care for people, you don't step away of your own accord before something bad happens.
What did they call it? Minor personality discrepancies? Is that what they called it? Honestly, that's what you're
That's
gonna
what you're
go with?
calling it?
We all have our days. But she is so diligent at her job. Like, honestly. And then at the very end of the story, to say, yeah, my sister-in-law she loves this place so much, she's not gonna give it to me. Burn it down.
Yeah,
Like,
I
what is
don't
that?
fully understand that thought process either.
Yeah, like, so she moves with her brother and sister-in-law to get away from this place in hopes of what I'm getting out of the story is like thought redirection, like change her thought process because now she's not in an environment that was causing these
Right.
ideas. Just because when you're an arsonist, you're only an arsonist in some spots of the world, I guess. I don't know. Like maybe that's what Mr. Bennett thought until she writes him and says, "Nay, nay, no, no. Um, you knew about this, and I'm still having these thoughts.
And I now want to burn down my current living.
Like my
Yeah.
brother's house because my sister-in-law likes it." I mean, the whole thing from start to end with Zelda was like this big roller coaster of situations, and then to end with this
Right.
nurse, just terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. Her whole life is just, it's heartbreaking, really. You feel for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Zelda Fitzgerald is worth remembering, though. Her life had a lot of sadness and confusion. However, Zelda was also a woman who went after what she wanted, and she wouldn't sit idle and be told what to do. She had fire in her soul and talent to go with it. Today, Zelda and Scott are laid to rest in Maryland at St. Mary's Church Historic Cemetery. Their gravestone reads as follows: "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." It was the very last line from The Great Gatsby. Thank you for listening to us today, and be sure to join us on our social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram. And until the peculiar calls for another tale, bye for now.